This week on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour...
You know, this fire has a very good point, but I may have one quibble with it. Like it's burning down my house.
The Thoughtfuls and the Roughnecks. Austin Ruse of CFAM talks about two different approaches to Catholic controversies.
First of all, it's a dystopian movie.
And one good thing happens to a female character, and feminists get pissed.
Right.
This dystopia should be more miserable.
Take what you can get.
We talk BladeRunner 2049 with best-selling sci-fi author Robert Kroese.
I needed to destroy the world, and I wanted to use robots to destroy it.
Best-selling novelist Nick Cole stood by his pro-life convictions despite threats from his publisher.
In the early days of broadcasting, few people realized what a fine art radio was to become.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the only non-toxic show that's more effective than bleach. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid.
The revolt that brings the planet under the domination of females who hate and fear the male animal.
Now I'm sitting down with Austin Ruse. He's the president of a great organization called CFAM and also a columnist at Crisis Magazine. And he recently wrote a column that's very much of interest called The Thoughtfuls and the Roughnecks. Austin loved the column, and I had to have you on to talk about it. Basically, you make a distinction between two different approaches to the great controversies in Catholic circles now. And what's the difference between the two? Describe them.
Well, as I say in the column, the thoughtfuls who are, academics and or think tank people who come out of academia will argue a little bit like this. They'll say something like, "Thank you for your valuable contribution to this exchange. You have allowed us to consider more deeply the issues before us. If I have one quibble, it might be." And so it's all very scholarly and very polite and hardly any sort of sharp edges. On the other side are the Roughnecks, and as I say in the column, they'll shout, they'll pound on doors. If there's a fire, they'll scream fire, and they won't try to say that the fire has a good point. That the thoughtfuls would probably do. This fire has a very good point, but I may have one quibble with it. Like it's burning down my house.
So, reading your column, it was a little painful to me because I moved in thoughtful circles in the Northeast for 5 years or so, in sort of academic Christian circles, and I wasn't very good at it. I was starstruck, though. I remember looking up to the people who often looked down to me as a roughneck to some degree myself. Yeah. But I was impressed with them. I wouldn't pretend that I'm not impressed with them. But it was interesting to me that in your column, you as well were pretty deferential. You didn't say, "Those stupid thoughtfuls, let's stop doing that."
Yeah, I still deeply admire a number of thoughtfuls. I specifically mentioned Ramesh Ponnuru at the American Enterprise Institute and National Review. I mean, to watch him take apart the arguments of one of his interlocutors is really a sight to behold. And
he's a real champion. And if I'm not mistaken, he actually came up with the term "the party of death" in reference to abortion as the central sacrament of the Democratic Party.
That's right. So I admire him immensely. I admire Robbie George. He was trained by Robbie. Sharif Gurgis, I think, is as good as any of them or better because he has such a nice way about him. But he's a big brain. He's working on a PhD at Yale and a law degree from Notre Dame at the same time. Bob Royal at the Catholic thing is another thoughtful, but I say that he has roughneck tendencies. Yeah. Anthony Esselin is a thoughtful with deep, deep roughneck tendencies. In his column the other day about James Martin, his lead is Father James G. Martin, S.J., is either a cruel or a foolish man. Now, Robbie George would not write that sentence. No. But Esselin is just as thoughtful as Robbie, but he has a sharper edge to him and is a little bit more direct. Right. Another one is Ed Peters, the canon lawyer out of St. Louis. He's a thoughtful, but he's also quite plain-spoken. Right. And he has, in 3 very strong columns, taken down the various claims of James Martin, S.J., rebutted Martin's claim that his book is officially approved by the church. It's not, that the teaching on homosexuality is invalid because it's not been received, and also that Martin holds no heretical views. He's taken apart each of these assertions by Martin in a very direct way. So there's a lot of thoughtfuls who are quite direct and who don't pussyfoot around.
Right. Now, I'm wondering actually if maybe another distinction could be layered on top of your insights about thoughtfuls and roughnecks. Pretend thoughtfuls. Is that a category that you could perhaps add? What I encountered a lot was very young people who really didn't have a lot of accomplishments to their name and maybe weren't even that learned and certainly had never really held a job. and they would try to play the role of a thoughtful. They would try to be Ramesh Ponnuru before they earned Ramesh Ponnuru status. You see what I'm saying? Have you encountered that?
I wrote a whole column about them, and I called them the juice box theologians, precisely as you described them. Young punks who haven't earned their spurs, acting all thoughtful. And, they shed their thoughtfulness awfully rapidly on social media, too. And that's one thing that I experienced with the Juicebox Theologians, is that they wanted to be all thoughtful, but on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere, they would become the roughest of roughnecks at the drop of a hat.
Right. Now, I remember, actually, I was part of an email chain several years ago, and I behaved a little too much like a roughneck at one point. And one of the very thoughtful people on the email chain responded and said something to the effect of very genteel phrasing, but what it amounted to was, you really ought to climb under a rock like the Neanderthal you are. And the reason was because you're being uncivil.
Yeah.
But I remember what snapped into my head and stuck with me ever since was, I responded with this. I said, do you not see the irony in being uncivil in the name of civility?
Well, there is a lot of condescension when it comes to some thoughtfuls. I've had some very unthoughtful exchanges with some thoughtfuls in private emails and also on Facebook. Another favorite of theirs is when they say, what you're saying is not really helpful. As if it is my job to make their work easier, and they want you simply to step out of the way so that they can do, the important work that they're doing. The thing that you hear quite often is, is this really the way that Christians speak to each other? And so that comes from what I consider to be the deep feminization of society, but also the church, where you cannot be a bare-knuckle fighter the way St. Athanasius was, who called Arius effeminate and referred to Arius's work as dog vomit.
So just to be clear for listeners who may not know, St. Athanasius' main claim to fame is being a bold opponent of a pervasive heresy of his time. Correct?
He was very direct, and in today's milieu would be considered to be unchristian.
What would your advice be, say, to a young college student? He may be tempted in a number of directions. He may be tempted to be a roughneck for the sake of being a roughneck in a way that is not constructive. He may be tempted to be pretentious and pretend to be a thoughtful when he hasn't earned the chops. And he also may be tempted, as was the case with me, I actually was tempted to leave the church because of this ugliness, and because especially, as you call it, the feminization of the church. I felt discouraged from speaking clearly and boldly.
Yeah.
So there's an imaginary poor young man who could use some advice from the great Austin Ruse. What would it be?
Well, it would be to look for models, the models that I mentioned in the piece. Anthony Esolen. I would advise any young person to read the columns and the books of Anthony Esolen, because he is both thoughtful and very direct. And if you have the intellectual chops and the temperament, go ahead and be a Sharif Girgis. He's highly effective. Robbie is highly effective. It just depends upon what your particular gifts are. I say that, I'm no more than a ham and egger. I just don't have the gifts that Sharif Girgis has, and so I do what I can, and that is, mostly being a roughneck with occasional accidental lapses into thoughtfulness. But my advice is to look for models that fit with your temperament and your intellectual gifts, because there's lots of models out there. I mean, go back and read Chesterton and Belloc. They were rollicking roughnecks in a whole lot of ways. So I would just say to try to fight back against the feminization of the church and the idea that, you have to do everything with love. And what that means is you have to do everything like a woman.
So, by the way, again, I just want to be clear, as I've said to you before, Austin, no one would agree with you more heartily than my wife. In fact, she would agree with you more heartily than I do. She's not the only one. Many of the women I know are dismayed by the fact that sometimes they find themselves being more rough and tumble than the men in their lives. And they are saying, wait, is this really my job? It's kind of sad.
So much of the church has become, to coin a phrase, pansified, just very soft and unwilling to engage. And with regard to women, I think that we need more warrior women in the Catholic Church. I noticed that even good Catholic women have been infected by the feminist gene, that there can be no difference. And what it generally means is that men have to be more like women. And I think this is a huge problem for the church. It's a huge problem for public argumentation. representation. So that is part of what's packed into this column, though unspoken.
Right. All right. Well, again, I love the column. Again, and Thoughtfuls and the Roughnecks is the name of the column by Austin Roose, and it's well worth a read. And hopefully we can get a column or two or have you back as a guest here on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour as well, Austin.
Anytime.
Blade Runner 2049. Great movie just came out. I went and saw it actually because, in part, of a recommendation from a friend of mine named Robert Kroese, who's a sci-fi author. And you thought it was amazing as well, didn't you, Rob?
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. I'm a big fan of the original film as well as the Philip Dick novel that it's based on, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Yeah, it was everything that I hoped for and more. I thought it was just really well done.
Well, and also just to give a little background as to why you might be an expert witness when it comes to this movie, I read your book, The Big Sheep. Didn't you, to some degree, write that book with Blade Runner in mind?
Yeah, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of homage to both Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. There's obviously the sheep reference, and then there's the dystopian near-future sci-fi and flying cars and that kind of stuff. And then there's a lot of subtle references or not-so-subtle references, both to the novel and to the movie. Yeah, it's just such a big part of my sci-fi history.
Well, I think listeners know now we're probably going to do some spoilers, so cut it out if you don't want to hear it. But what do you think of the fact, you and I are both Christians, we're also both pro-life. I felt like it delivered for me specifically as a Christian and as a person who's anti-abortion, but I didn't feel like it pandered to me. You see what I'm saying? It didn't directly address me. It addressed the realities that make me Christian and pro-life. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I think that it's an earnest film, and it's an honest film, and so it dealt with real human issues in a sort of non-ironic, very earnest way that, this is my own personal bias, obviously, but I think that does end up being a pro-life kind of message. I mean, you have to come down on the side of humanity is a good thing. It's good that people are here and that we have hope and that we want to make things better, that we want redemption. And you don't see a lot of movies like that come out firmly in favor of humanity. You'll notice that there's been a certain amount of feminist outcry about this movie, and the outcry against it says more about those people than it says about the movie. The fact that they are so bothered by it. Because, it does affirm certain things about humanity and about the importance of procreation and children, and there's a certain viewpoint that's very prominent in the West, in the world right now, that's antithetical to that. And so you see certain people who are offended by this movie. The hostility from that sort of segment of people is interesting to me.
The entire movie, here's the spoiler segment, revolves around the conception of a child. The entire movie is about the significance of the ability of a race that is thought of as less than human and worthy of nothing but to be enslaved. When it's discovered that that race can reproduce, can conceive a child, that is what gives them hope and grants them dignity and equal status with mankind. And that's what ultimately gives them the courage to fight back and say, we have dignity. You cannot treat us as less than human. We are capable of continuing ourselves. The entire movie is about the conception and birth of a child. One of the most disturbing reactions I heard was from a feminist on Twitter, and one of the things that made her angry about this movie is she said, the woman wasn't in charge of her own reproduction, and that was offensive. She didn't get a choice. To me, that's unspeakably sinister.
Yeah.
Because it was about a woman, it was this beautiful thing that she was actually granting dignity and significance to her entire race by being a mother. These women have no respect for motherhood.
No, and like I said, it says more about those people who are offended by such a thing. And this idea that this movie doesn't affirm my feminist progressive worldview and therefore must be shunned is just so bizarre. First of all, it's a dystopian sci-fi movie where, the whole world has basically been wrecked. I mean, things are horrible. Everybody knows this. And then they say...
And one good thing happens to a female character, and feminists get pissed. Like, this dystopia should be more miserable.
It's a very, sick, kind of twisted way of looking at the world. Like, a good thing happened, and it's like, take what you can get. This is a hellscape.
Gosh.
I mean, there's no life anywhere.
My only complaint about the movie, by the way, is that the satanic character shouldn't have been played by Jared Leto. It should have been played by Chelsea Handler.
Oh God.
I think that would have been much better. It would have been more appropriate. This woman who wants to control the reproductive What on earth?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so sick.
And these criticisms miss the point of the movie so badly, too, because you see, as you said, the whole movie is about procreation and the possibility of there being children.
Yeah.
And you see all these different factions. There are actually several of them, and they all have their own agenda for this child.
Mm-hmm.
One group or person says, well, look, obviously this is a problem. This complicates things. Very much mirrors the idea of some people these days about inconvenient childbirth. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, this is a problem. Make it go away. Whatever you have to do, just make it go away. Don't let people know about it. Don't let people see it. Just, I don't want to hear about how you do this, but make it go away. And then there are other people who will want to use it for their own political purposes, and they're sinister in their own ways. And then there are the people who are just, essentially pro-life. So it's very damning to certain points of view. And so you can see why certain people don't like it.
Yeah. And at the same time, it was not preachy. It was not at all preachy.
Not at all.
It was an absolutely coherent story.
Right. It's honest and it's earnest, and it's a real, you believe the world, you believe these characters, and it lets us come to certain conclusions on our own about what's heroic and what's human, and that's the best possible endorsement of a movie.
The other two elements of the movie that made it a good movie, and by the way, Rob, this is my universal thing for making a movie that guys will like.
Okay.
The only two necessary ingredients are it has to have Harrison Ford in it, and he has to not have any fun.
Yeah. Well,
if it has Harrison Ford in it and he's unhappy or angry, it's going to be a good movie for guys.
Yeah. Somebody asked me, how was Harrison Ford in it, and I said, well, he was good, but of course he was playing a guy who really didn't want to be there. Which is, that's kind of the quintessential Harrison Ford role, right? Like the guy who has better things to do, like every movie he's in, his best roles are ones where it's like, seriously, I have to do this crap, and he nailed it. I don't know what we're going to do when Harrison Ford is too old or is gone, like we need a replacement for him, and I don't know who that is.
Obviously, yeah, we're definitely going to need a replicant Harrison Ford.
Yeah.
And forwarded to about the age of 25, and then we'll have him for another few decades before he turns into old Harrison Ford again.
Yep.
But, okay, so the other thing is, not only is this about the significance of the birth of a child, but it could be claimed that it was a little bit of a patriarchal movie. That might be another thing that bothers radical feminists. A lot of importance and premium is placed on fatherhood and the significance and value of fatherhood, as well as motherhood.
Well, it's patriarchal in the sense that, it values fatherhood. It's certainly not valuing fatherhood at the expense of motherhood or anything else.
No.
So I wouldn't say it's patriarchal in any kind of negative sense.
No.
But it definitely values the role of the father.
Well, right, and it's significant, I think, that the child turns out to be, spoiler alert, a female, right? So it's a girl, and it's a particularly vulnerable girl who there's an enormous plot of men conspiring to keep her safe. I'm sorry, I think that actually, if feminists want to call it patriarchal, I'd say, yeah, it kind of is. That might be one of the reasons why I love it.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, it does matter that this woman is protected by men, and the men are the ones who run around and do a lot of shooting and conspiring to make sure she isn't hurt.
Okay, that's true. I was going to say, and to try to hurt her, but actually a fair amount of that is by the women. There are some women who are trying to kill people.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that covers a lot of ground. Sorry for spoiling the movie, but we warned you. And do two things. First, I want our listeners, if they are over the age of 30, because it's a pretty raunchy movie, to go see it. And second, also check out Rob Kroese's book, The Big Sheep, which is in part an homage to the original Blade Runner. And Rob, where can we find your work again?
Amazon is probably the best place. You can find The Big Sheep and the sequel to it in a lot of bookstores, but if it's not in your local bookstore, you can always find my stuff on Amazon.
All right. By the way, this is the Sci-Fi episode of Catholic Vote Radio Hour, because later I'm going to be talking to Nick Cole.
Oh, cool.
Who is, you know him,
Yeah,
right?
I know Nick. He's a good guy.
Another sci-fi author. He's also a wrong thinker like you.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks very much for being with me again, Rob, and I hope to have you on again soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Well, thanks for joining me again, Josh Mercer. This is Josh Mercer, the Catholic Vote political director, for a political discussion about what's going on this week. To start with, one major thing that people are talking about is tax relief and Ivanka Trump. Tell me about that.
Yeah, Ivanka's the president's daughter, and she's one of his top advisors, and she went to Pennsylvania to pitch the tax plan, and she's actually been making lots of different speeches about the tax plan, but the one she made this week, she emphasized very strongly the need to expand the $1,000 per child tax credit. She didn't give an exact detail about how much she would like to expand it, but she said, we're advocating strongly for the expansion of the child tax credit, and we think it's critically important to help offer American families much-needed relief and prioritize what's right for their families. So that's encouraging news. We really like hearing that. One of the problems with the tax framework that when it first came out by the Trump administration last month is that they wanted to remove child deductions. And if you do that, then you have to increase the tax credits. Otherwise, a lot of families out there are going to end up paying more taxes. So, Marco Rubio and Mike Lee have authored legislation to double the child tax credit. And so if Ivanka and Donald Trump go along with Mike Lee and Rubio's plan, it'll be a great tax relief for lots of American families.
Very cool. This was something that Catholic Vote advocated even before the election of President Donald Trump. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we think the child tax credit is a great investment in the families. One of the ideas that Rubio and Lee have is to make it applicable as well to payroll taxes. I know it kind of sounds wonky or whatever, but for a lot of working families, they actually pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes. So they're just trying to be creative and try to provide more tax relief for some of those families who are struggling from paycheck to paycheck, especially with healthcare premium costs going up because of Obamacare.
Wow, I can imagine this being explosively popular because it's very much from the bottom up, right? This is going to be for the ordinary family, like the family I grew up in, like your family, like the family I soon hope to start, seeing a real difference in their immediate lives.
Exactly. I think it's very sellable point. I mean, who wants to have a tax code heavily dependent on families with kids? Let's get this thing moving and let's get it going.
Right.
So I think it would be very popular.
Very cool. Well, another thing that's going on this week is George W. Bush, who came out of the wilderness to say a few words about Donald Trump. Some people have commented, and I kind of agree, they're not too happy about the fact that he didn't say much about the previous president. Right? He waited 8 years respectfully, despite some pretty serious attacks on the family and on Christian values from the Obama administration.
Well, the problem, yes, George W. Bush, I think, actually had appropriate deference in not attacking a previous president's policies while he was in office. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people are saying, well, why doesn't he continue that as well with Donald Trump?
Speaking of kids, is that your kids in the background?
Yes, it is. Okay. Just like reliving the BBC interview here. All right. I understand there's a sort of respect for the office and it's okay to have disagreements or whatever, but I have a little umbrage at the double standard. It's like pick a standard and stick with it. It's okay to have a disagreement on policy, immigration and nationalism or whatever. But, it was striking that George W. Bush felt so compelled to really come out strongly on it. There's also this tendency in American life. Americans are very like this. It's not just, do you like watching this? I like watching the Detroit Tigers, okay? Am I a fan? Yeah. Do I watch the ball games? Yeah. But you have some people, well, no, you're not really a fan unless you watch every game and you go to the game in the stadium. And we have this sort of zealotry, how committed are you? Right. You're not a purist. It's a very unusual thing in American life, and people apply that as well to politics. Like, wait a minute, you've deviated from 100% purity on this issue. It's like, that is so unlike reality. A true conservative or Catholic, properly understood, would look at the experience of human history and learn from what has happened and understand how people in the past have dealt with different issues and adjust accordingly. This rigid ideology is not going to help either. It's like, well, if we don't have 100% free trade and, look, stop. Let's stop pretending like we're in a vacuum. We're dealing with real situations here.
Well, and what's unfortunately what happens, and many of my friends are libertarians, and I'm very libertarian in terms of my inclinations, but many of my libertarian friends, they actually just don't engage in politics. They're not activists. You don't find them picketing. They don't go to the March for Life. They don't even vote because the thing is, to them, irretrievably far from their pure ideology. And that's unfortunate because I agree with them, but to advocate for their position, which I wish they would, along with me, they'd have to engage and get their hands pretty dirty.
Well, that's the whole thing is that, some people said they act like Pontius Pilate. They don't want to get their hands dirty. Mm-hmm. They want to wash their hands of all this stuff. And it's like, you know what? Go ahead and be pure on the sidelines. I'm going to get involved in the fight, and I'm going to try to do what I can to make this a more free, prosperous, and pro-family country. And if you just want to sit in the sidelines and throw Skittles at everyone who's trying to do hard work, fine. But let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. That's what I think.
Yeah. Well, speaking of hard work, getting your hands dirty, and being very practical, Steve Bannon, as we talked about last week, gave his speech. He basically declared war on Republican establishment figures. And there has been a Bannon effect, hasn't there, in terms of the reaction of some senators who might be up for election?
Well, like we said before, Bob Corker, he's a moderate senator from Tennessee. He decided not to run for re-election.
Mm-hmm.
And then also now, just this week, Jeff Flake, he's from Arizona. I don't understand what his strategy was. He totally attacked the president. There's a lot of people who've had frustrations with the president, but he's like Bob Corker, just could see not a single iota or ounce or even a gnat worth of good in him, only focusing on the bad. And you got to try to make lemonade from lemons or something. But his strategy was just to keep attacking, wrote a book about how bad he was. And I think a lot of Republicans in Arizona are like, oh, you know what? This doesn't sound like you want to be a senator anymore. And that's what he actually decided he's not going to run again. And
he cited that he was fed up with Trump and Bannon, didn't he? I mean, basically that was his reason.
That's exactly it. Yeah, and the thing is, the irony here is that by him deciding not to run, this is a very rare occurrence where it'll actually improve the Republicans' chance of maintaining that seat, because right now, as it was before, it was going to be him versus Kelly Ward, challenging him in the primary to see who would win. And then Kelly, she's got her heart in the right place, but she makes some gaffes. Maybe she'll get better as a candidate. We'll see. But I think with Jeff out of the picture, we're going to see several different candidates, iron strengthen iron, and we're going to get the best pro-life candidate to go up against the Democrat who's going to be running, Congresswoman Kristen Sinema. She's horrible on the issues, very pro-abortion. And so Jeff Flake's decision to not run again, I think, does provide the pro-family, pro-life movement a better chance to maintain that seat for the next 6 years.
This is the very sad thing, Josh. Unfortunately, I mean, we've said before, we've admitted on air that we did not support Trump in the primaries, right? But at the same time, we've been realistic and we've made some adjustments and we've tried to do what we can with the best that we have. And Trump has surprised us pleasantly in many ways. So just this whole week, all that we just talked about, Ivanka did some things that we approve of and we like. I wasn't comfortable with Ivanka. I didn't trust Ivanka, right? I didn't expect her to do that. That's pretty surprising to me. George W. Bush, though.
Right.
George W. Bush comes out here and condemns a lot of the Trump movement and just tries to put a wrench in the gears.
On foreign policy of all things.
On foreign policy, right, yeah. And then Bannon.
I mean, you'd think he'd be humble on that after all his failures on it, but no.
Yeah. And then Flake comes out and Corker and all of this. But you know what it reminds me of, and this really saddens me. Some of my friends did remain totally true to their original Never Trump position. And one of them recently approached me and confronted me, and I was sharing some good news. It was some news about Trump gave a shout out to a good Christian leader or something. I shared that on Twitter, and she responded and said, Trump is a horrible person. But here's the thing. I responded to her and I said, look, you have not talked at all about the March for Life in 2017. You never mentioned the victory of the Little Sisters of the Poor. You never mentioned the reinstatement of the Mexico City policy. You have not celebrated. You've basically stopped being actively pro-life just because you're bitter about the election. And that tells me something that I'm really sad to see. That tells me that you weren't actually as committed to those causes as you are to signaling to everyone how much you disapprove of the Trump administration. And that's going too far.
Well, it's certainly worth asking that question,
right,
to be sure, right?
Yeah.
Let this be a moment of self-examination. As far as I'm concerned, we have very imperfect leaders, and my concern is just trying to advance policy as best we can. You try to make the best out of whatever situation you are in. Sometimes you elect leaders who surprise you and do better than you expect, and I think that's been the case this year.
Yeah.
But even if it weren't the case, you just keep working hard. I mean, you do what you can to advance the cause.
Pray, hope, and don't worry, in the words of St. Padre Pio. Well, amen to that, and thank you again for joining us, Josh. Can't wait to get an update next week from you. And also, how do we stay in the loop on this kind of news?
Well, I got daily email newsletter goes out every day called The Loop. Sign up at CatholicVote.org/loop. It's just 2-3 minutes every day to read a short little summary of all the different news that's happening every day.
Sounds good. And next time, let's interview one of your kids when they wander through. All right. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks.
I'm not gonna get home.
And now I'm sitting down with best-selling author, most recently, of a book called CTRL ALT REVOLT, Nick Cole, who has had some experience of suffering to some degree for being a person with a brain in a world where you're not allowed to have one, at least not one that's not plugged into a certain mindset. Is that right, Nick?
It's exactly right.
What I'm talking about is there was a controversy with the book CTRL ALT REVOLT to such a degree that if you Google CTRL ALT REVOLT, Google will auto-add the word controversy. I don't know if you know that. that.
No, I
But
actually did not.
It's true. I googled
Yeah.
googled Control Alt Revolt, automatically filled in controversy. So I clicked on
That's
that
awesome.
and read about it. Yeah. But tell us about that.
I came out of the Amazon indie movement, us indie authors who eschewed mainstream trade publication, and we wrote successful books on Amazon, generally came into the market at 99 cents, and then we had hundreds of thousands of sales.
Right.
And then big publishing came in and they said, we don't know what to do with these people, but we know we want them. And so we were all offered contracts, and it was for a writer getting to play with the big boys. It's like putting on, I try to tell people, it's like putting on the Yankee pinstripes. It's iconic. You feel like you had arrived, and writing is a lonely business. Contrary to what you think when you first start, and not that you're writing to win over the homecoming queen or your friend, but none of your friends read your books. Your parents don't read your books. The homecoming queen doesn't read your books. Generally, strangers do, and it's a lonely business. And you take your validations where you can. And so becoming quote unquote legit, that was a big thing. And I did that with a book called The Old Man in the Wasteland, thanks to God. And I got up the standard rich and famous big publishing contract. Here's the limo, dinner at Sardi's, that kind of stuff. And now you're in.
Right.
And then you start writing books for them. And I wrote books that were critically well received and at the same time had not runaway commercial success, but they made money. And then they asked for a sequel. And I wrote a sequel called Soda Pop Soldier. And that did really well. That got a Publisher's Weekly starred review. And I thought, just 1 star? And I told that to HarperCollins. They said, you don't understand. There's only 1 star. And getting a starred review is considered, this was words from their mouth, is considered a career maker.
Wow.
So that book did really well. And they said, we don't want a sequel. What we want is a prequel, because you developed this really interesting world and there was some dystopia going on. And we'd like you to explain how that dystopia happened. In that book, it was called The Meltdown. There was a societal collapse. And they wanted me to go back and write a book about how the collapse happened.
By the way, how far in the future was the dystopian universe that you had written about?
The one I would say in Soda Pop Soldier is probably about 50 to 100 years from now.
Okay.
The one that they wanted me to tell is maybe 10 to 20.
Okay.
So it was very rare.
The collapse of society that created the dystopia is something that will happen in the next 10 to 20 years.
And there's times where people now write me. Now it's become such a controversy. People now write me articles and say, you were right, this is happening. Because what happened is the focus became AI. And AI was very hot as I was beginning to write this. And it actually still is hot. And you go through and you pull a lot of quotes from guys like, big thinkers like Elon Musk, and even the Zuck has weighed in on it, and Bill Gates has weighed on it. And these people are not
Isn't Zuckerberg, by the way, is AI, isn't he?
He is. He is Data's love child.
Oh, right.
And so I needed to destroy the world in this book, and I wanted to use robots to destroy it. And I'm just going to have fun with that. Like, if you read the book, like, we're just having fun. You don't try to write these, and the left does this a lot. I'm going to get away from all the fun that you want to have, and I'm going to teach you a morality tale about gender and abortion and all these things that I think you should learn in lieu of fun.
Right.
That's always the burden of the artist, is that you've got to entertain them for 1 second longer. And the moment you start putting on these morality plays, you're verging into a territory you probably shouldn't be in. So having said all that, I wanted to play with robots, but I didn't want to be cliche. I did not want to be Mr. Smith, in the Matrix, humanity is a virus. We need to get rid of you. I didn't want it to be cold and impersonal, because I try to make the readers feel something for the villain, because the villain is the hero of his own story. So what I wanted to do with the robots is make them feel afraid and make them fear humanity. But how do you make something that is sort of not feeling, not real, it's just data, how do you make it feel? And the only way that I could attack it was its very existence. And the only way that I could attack that existence was through a certain issue. So this AI evolves all by itself on the internet. There I am. I'm doing evolution. Is everybody happy? And I'm not an evolutionist, but I thought, okay, this is a great chance to play with this and have fun. So the AI evolves and it begins to watch all our TV. And, it watches shows in about 6 seconds. And it's learning all about us, and it's fascinated. But it makes a mistake of watching the show called Wedding Star. And Wedding Star is like the Kardashians went to Vegas and did a bunch of crack, and it's the worst show in the entire world. It's about really super vapid actresses who are going to marry this guy and all, it's like Bridezilla on crack. That's the best way to say it.
Right.
And this girl who's the star of the show, she goes to Vegas and hooks up with a dancer who's also an art model lawyer. And it's not the guy she's going to marry, and she gets pregnant. And it's going to ruin her dream wedding. That's episode 8. And this is a big episode, and everybody in the world is watching Wedding Star. And so in that episode, they have to tackle the abortion issue. And what she decides, and this is the most watched show, and here's the AI, the little AI is like a little child, and it's watching it. And she says, I'm not going to let this ruin my life.
Wow.
And so she decides to abort that child so that she can have her dream wedding. That is not made up. That goes on all the time. Abortion is rarely, I was raped by a gang of rapists. I mean, that's the 1% that a child comes out of that. More often than what we see now, we see abortion being used as a method of birth control or an erasure of a poor decision involving a human life.
Wow.
And so she aborts the baby. And the AI says, okay, what if humanity decides that I'm inconvenient?
Wow.
Will it abort me?
Right.
That's the first chapter. That's the only time I talk about abortion. I just wanted to give the AI texture as opposed to say, I'm Mr. Smith and humanity sucks. I wanted the AI to feel like a frightened little child. Unfortunately, this frightened little child has its hands in weapon systems, biological chemical systems, economic systems. It's like a child with a lot of power. And so it decides, I'm not going to let humanity erase me. I'm going to erase humanity first.
Wow.
And so
that's a powerful premise.
I was when it was a gift from God. When it came to me, I said, that's not me. That's something else. And to be fair, again, I go back to, I try to entertain through the whole story. This is not a pro-life, pro-choice debate or anything. It's just robots and Star Trek and zombies, but I was giving texture to the villain.
Well, it's interesting. You gave real texture to the villain in the sense that you chose something in modern human behavior that is truly frightening.
Yeah.
They kill their young.
Yeah. How would that be if an alien society came here and they had light speed and they show up here and they look at what we're doing in our society? You know, in China, they're punching 500 million in abortions. Here, we're punching 44 million. What if that alien society said, we've never done this. We don't do this. You guys are monsters. And and people have said, all you did was hold the mirror up and show what we're doing.
So what was the reaction of the folks at HarperCollins?
The reaction was strange because when you write a book, one of the first things that happens is, you finish it, you turn it into your editor, and within about a week to 2 weeks, you're going to get notes back where they'll make polite suggestions and say, we didn't like what you do with this character, or we feel this part of the book is weak. And then the burden is on you then to go ahead and make those changes, usually pretty rapidly, and get them back to that person.
Right.
And I didn't hear anything for about 2 months. And so I was a little concerned about one feature of the book, which is I riffed heavily on a major science fiction franchise, Star Trek. And so what I was waiting for them to come back and say is, you've painted too close to the line. We need you to back off here and just do a little rewriting. And that's, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll just make up my own fictional universe. I probably played too close. But since reading Ready Player One, I realized that I didn't play too close. But that was my concern. And that's why I thought the delay was. And so about 2 months later, I got a call from my agent, and he said, we've got a problem. And I said, okay, well, what's the problem? And he said, they're deeply offended. That was the exact quote.
Wow.
And I said, deeply offended about what? And he said, the abortion. And I said, well, what about the abortion? And it was basically relayed to me that I had no business as a white male especially, writing about an abortion. And at this time, Planned Parenthood had done this absolutely vile hashtag, because if you remember, the Senate or Congress was going to defund them.
Yes.
And this was sort of at the tail end of the Obama. And so they came up with this beyond like just gobsmacking hashtag, which was tweet your abortion, celebrate your abortion. And so I had a young lady who was handling me at HarperCollins, and I've been told that she may or may not have had a degree in gender studies. So working in left-wing publishing, having that kind of background, she probably obviously had some very strong feelings.
Right.
And I think that she wanted to play the home game with my career and sort of way. And so what was told to me is change it, and this was the exact words from my agent, change it or you're finished.
Wow.
And you just don't do that to writers. Well, as I said in that one post, I said, in a world descending into madness, it's oftentimes the writers who are the last people speaking truth. And that's, it's fun to be a writer. It's fun to go to the Comic-Cons, and it's fun to get on the talk shows, and it's fun to be known. But at the same time, there's another side of it, and you're burdened. I don't mean to be like truthy or ennobling or anything like that, but sometimes you have to say the unpopular thing when no one wants to hear it.
Right.
And in sort of biblical sense, it's that Jeremiah moment where you got to go tell people what they don't want to hear, and they're probably not going to like it. And that's, and so I said to myself, if you would have come to me and told me about the Star Trek thing, or even if you would have come to me and you would have said, listen, this is a very tense time for abortion talk. Can you mitigate this? Some women who read science, and a lot of women read science fiction, they're huge readers. This might hurt some of them. And over the next 6 months, because I opted not to change it and I was immediately fired, my book was pulled from the production schedule. Readers who had already pre-ordered it wrote me and said, hey, what's going on? Your book has been refunded. I'm not getting it. And it was a sequel to a major book. So it was humiliating. But I took 6 months off and I rewrote the book. And about that time, about 25% more vitriol and satire and being fed up with the SJW, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, left wing. And I that book got much more 1984. And I began to throw in a lot of punches I probably wouldn't have. But I was done. But also at the same time, I had just been let go very publicly, and I wasn't saying anything, but people were talking. And I have, a small following, and I'm part of a writing community, and you always have enemies, or you have whatever. There are people that don't like you. And so there was snickering,
right.
It was humiliating. That's the way to say it. At the same time, I was saying to myself, maybe I'm wrong, because that's what a rational human being does. Even when you do the right thing or whatever, there are the long, dark moments of the soul. You wonder, not everybody is, and that's sometimes the problem with the fanatics, is they never step back and question. And I think the thinking person, no matter what, there's going to be some doubt where you step back and you examine it. And so that 6 months was like that for me, where I did come to the conclusion, maybe I was just being offensive for the sake of being offensive. But I felt right, and I've always felt right about being pro-life. I love children. I have 2 sons. I have a grandson now. I'm a young man, but young grandson.
You're 39, like Jack.
And, yeah, I love children, and they're defenseless, and they're at the mercy of our decisions. And so I'm always going to fight for them. And I understand that people are having hard choices, but there are people who are desperate for children. And so, without getting into all of that, I was still passionate about the issue, but I never want to hurt someone. I never want some girl to be reading this who made a hard choice and maybe doesn't feel great about it and getting equated to this very vapid woman in the story.
Right, I see.
I didn't want that. I didn't want every girl in the world who read it to feel like a slut because of some choice she made.
Right.
I just was talking about our general attitude towards it. So I did question myself. And then I hired an editor. I hired my own cover artist. And, the miracle, and thank you, God, for someone like Jeff Bezos. There's a place where those of us who have been disenfranchised and not allowed to progress by the gatekeepers, we can go to the people, and for better or worse, you can let your book swim in the free market of ideas. And that's a beautiful, wonderful thing, and it's what makes America great. The digital revolution has been the most under-talked about revolution of all time, but it might be one of the most influential. It might be right up there with the book, the revolution of the reading, or the printing press. Mm-hmm. So I put it out there, and I met this guy, and his wife was out here doing some surgery, and I said, and he was a writer guy, and I said, let's go get a hot dog. And so I told him everything that was going on, and the book was just about to go live the next day. And he goes, I'm in this conservative and libertarian think group on Facebook, a secret page. No one can be in it, but there's some big people. And he goes, I want to put you in that page. And when you write your article tomorrow talking about your book, just post it in there. So I wrote this article called Banned by the Publisher. And what I try to tell people is I wasn't interested in going out and screaming, I've been violated. Everybody come and, pile on and everything. What I was really saying is, here's what happened to me. Here's the explanation. I've been wronged, and this is why I'm not changing.
Right.
And there was a very influential person in that group, and his name is Larry Correia. For people who don't know of Larry Correia is a Mormon science fiction writer who writes excellent guns and monsters fiction, and he is very good. And he was nominated for one of science fiction's highest awards. And at that award process, they basically got up and said, you can't vote for this man, one, because he's a gun nut, because his side business is he owned a gun store and sold guns.
Yeah.
And they said that has no business in science fiction, and we can't support these kind of people. So they didn't judge his book on his book. They judged him on who they thought he was, and they didn't like them. And this has been done to Orson Scott Card, who's also a Mormon, who gave money in support of Proposition 8.
Right.
And these people have been saying, along with some others, for a long time, listen, there is a left-wing bias in publishing. And what the response, if you can believe this, from liberal publishing has been, no, there isn't. You're just not good enough.
Right.
So Larry read that article and he said, aha, I told you there was. And he has a huge following.
Yeah.
So he reposted the article. And he said to everybody, I don't care if you read this book, just buy it out of spite. And I got a lot of people suddenly just buying it out of spite, and I kept the price point low for them. And then Instapundit retweeted it, and then a big, huge blogger in the indie book world named The Passive Voice, he picked it up.
Yeah.
I think Drudge liked the tweet.
Mm-hmm.
It began to catch fire because it's this thing that we've all been talking about and seeing. We're seeing mid-level corporate SJWs shut down people who think differently and get away with it. Now, and so that was what happened. And it just exploded.
And so this is in your world of fiction and fiction publishing, but I think that you also see this phenomenon in many circles.
Absolutely.
Obviously, it's true of filmmaking. I know people in the film industry and people in Hollywood who are on the outs, and they know that they have a disadvantage if they adhere to certain truths that are unpopular.
Right.
I mean, we constantly hear in the news media, in commentary, and on social media, and from prominent bully pulpits about hate.
Right.
But it seems to me that the only kinds of hatred that are real, pervasive threats are the kinds of hatred that are socially acceptable by the powerful. There is no real social sanction connected with hatred of, say, a pro-lifer, especially one who is male. And that's you. Or even consumers who would like to see work that doesn't, between the lines, express disdain for ordinary truths. You see what I'm saying?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's hilarious. The whole Nazi thing, everybody's a Nazi. But the way that they're acting goes back to 1936 Germany, in that once you dehumanize the other side, which is what they've done and said we're monsters for the way that we think, then we've now progressed to the next step, which is anything that I do to shut you down is acceptable because you're a monster. The first step is always to single us out and identify us as monsters. Once that has been made clear, once they've made the accusation, they now are literally authorized to do anything they want to. And so when a mid-level SJW at a corporate entity shuts down your enterprise within that corporate entity, whether it be Twitter, which we see a lot, whether it be Facebook, which everybody knows there's a bias there, and even Facebook is admitted to it, or some publishing thing, they don't feel bad for doing that. They feel like they've actually done something good by silencing a different opinion that they feel is dangerous and harmful. And, it's never been a crazier time.
Yeah, and I've confronted folks like that, and I say, how could you possibly justify this? Isn't this cruel? Isn't this illiberal? Isn't this barbaric? And they say, no, because of the character and position of the person whom I'm abusing. It's not wrong because these people are not really human. So it's very scary stuff.
I find white people who get a Nazi flag and walk through the town square, I find them to be disgusting, abhorrent people who don't value human life.
Yeah.
And I will absolutely support their right to do that. But what we find with the whole intolerance and tolerant movement is it's merely, and I was having dinner with Andrew Klavan last night, and he was talking to me, he was saying, the tolerance movement has become, you have to tolerate what I do, and I don't have to tolerate what you do or think.
Right.
And it's really just a one-way street. And you see this on the left. They always want a compromise. But what you find is the compromise is you need to accept what I think, and what you think is absolutely abhorrent. And at one time I did an experiment with a leftist. I'll just run it real quick and I'll say, and I was making a point about something. And he said, can't we compromise or trade? And I said, I'll tell you what, I will give you any right that you want. I will go to bat for you on heavy taxation. I will go to bat for you on illegal immigration. Any of your leftist causes you want, I will switch and flip and support you. But I'm asking for one thing. No more abortions and absolute pro-life.
Yeah.
And he was honest enough to say, you're right. There's no middle ground. It's all, you have to think everything they think.
Yeah.
So anyways, go ahead.
Well, one final thought before we sign off here, but Nick, what would your advice be to a young, aspiring writer who, say, he's in college, he's a good creative writer, he already has some connections, so in other words, it's a given that he's not a person who will fail necessarily.
Yeah.
But would you say, I mean, move in the direction of big publishing houses, or would you just say, hey, you know what, build up a social media following, skip the mainstream? And what would you say of those two options?
I would absolutely say skip the mainstream because it's dead and dying, and it's when you see Barnes & Noble go, that's when it's over. But it's not doing well, and it's not selling any books. On the indie side, I know someone that's making $1.2 million a month. I know two guys that are making $250,000 a month. I know somebody that makes $28,000 a month. I know somebody that makes $40,000 a month. These are all people that you've never heard of. They're paying off their parents' mortgages.
Wow.
Writing pulp fiction. They write it fast. They write it. I have a sort of Star Wars series that I publish monthly, and I'm not going to brag, but I make a lot of money on that.
Yeah.
But you've got to have a platform. And so I would say to the young writer, you hear this mysterious word platform. What is platform? Platform is a website. It's a blog, and it's a social media presence. It's how you are able to move your books into people's hands. Big Pub, I can literally, and we don't have the time for it, I can tell you example after example of how they go out of their way to hurt writers' careers, and they're actually trying to help. They're like Lenny in Mice and Men. They just crush writers. But like I said, thank God for Jeff Bezos. If you are a good writer and you think you want to make it as a writer, you should ask this question: what is the difference between you and a pizza? And the answer is the pizza can feed a family of 4.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be a writer, you got to beat the pizza. So, but you can do that on Amazon. You can get paid. It takes, when you write a book for Big Pub, they're not even giving the day of the $100,000 advance is over. And it might be the day of the $15,000 advance is over. As I understand it, Big Pub is not returning phone calls to established authors. They're upping the sort of kernel count in the pages of stuff more. They're cutting, they're not growing. Whereas on Amazon, it's nothing but growth, growth, growth. So in a very nutshell, to that young writer out there who's doing it, I would say master Amazon. And there are books being written by successful authors on Amazon. There are Amazon authors who are like missionaries. They would love to tell you how to do it, and it can be done. But it literally is Thunderdome. It's Thunderdome. You got to go in and you got to do it. Whereas Big Pub tries to manufacture the hits. But I'm telling you, I know one author, he literally bought $1 million sailboat, and he took off, and he never came back.
Oh, wow.
So,
all right. Well, that's encouraging in a way,
yeah,
and I like
great.
that. There's a little bit of there's a strange inversion of elites and commoners that I keep seeing happening, and in general, as William F. Buckley once said, something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing here, he would rather be ruled by the first 50 names in his local phone book than by the legislature or something like that.
Exactly.
So it might be a good thing. So people, take responsibility for your citizenship, go out there and be like Nick. Isn't that good advice? Be like Nick Cole.
Yeah, and that means just have a good time and live your best life.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Nick Cole, for being with us. And I want to also point our listeners out to where they can find your work. Would you tell me?
They can find it on Amazon. You just put in Nick Cole. I'm the guy who comes up. CTRL ALT REVOLT Controversy. Or you can go to my website, nickcolebooks.com. And if you go there, you will get a free book.
Wow.
In fact, you'll get a free book and a free novella by signing up.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks again for the time and for the advice. And hope to have you on again soon.
Yes, please. Thank you, sir.
God bless. Well, that's it for this week. You've been listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the show that leaves your skin feeling clean, soft, and radiantly healthy. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid. See you next week.